Hello, I'm Lucy Hughes Hallett. I've written several books, including The Pike, about d'Annunzio, here it is. But I'm here to talk to Jung Chang, whose wonderful book, The Wild Swans, was published 25 years ago.
Yes.
And we're going to start with Jung reading a passage from the book.
Okay, thank you, Lucy. I'm going to read a passage about me going to see my mother when she was in the camp in the early 1970s during the Cultural Revolution. I stayed 10 days and was to depart for my father's camp on New Year's Day. My nice truck driver was to pick me up where he had dropped me off. My mother's eyes moistened because, although his camp was not far away, she and my father were forbidden to visit each other. I put the food basket on my back untouched. My mother insisted I take the whole lot to my father. Saving precious food for others has always been a major way of expressing love and concern in China. My mother was very sad that I was going and kept saying she was sorry I had to miss the traditional Chinese New Year breakfast, which her camp was going to serve. Tangyuan, round dumplings symbolizing family union. But I could not wait for it for fear of missing the truck. My mother walked half an hour with me to the roadside, and we sat down in the high grass to wait. The sweep of the landscape undulated with the gentle waves of the thick Kogan grass. The sun was already bright and warm. My mother hugged me, her whole body seeming to say that she did not want to let me go, and that she was afraid she would never see me again. At the time, we didn't know whether her camp and my commune would ever come to an end. We had been told we would be there for life. There were hundreds of reasons why we might die before we saw each other again. My mother's sadness infected me, and I thought of my grandmother dying before I was able to get back from Ningnan. The sun rose higher and higher. There was no trace of my truck. As the large rings of smoke that had been pouring out of the chimney of her camp in the distance thinned down, my mother was seized by regret that she had not been able to give me the New Year's breakfast. She insisted on going back to get some for me. While she was away, the truck came. I looked toward the camp and saw her running toward me, the white golden grass surging around her blue scarf. In her right hand, she carried a big, colorful enameled bowl. She was running with the kind of carefulness that told me she did not want the soup with the dumplings to spill. She was still a good way off, and I could see she would not reach me for another 20 minutes or so. I did not feel I could ask the driver to wait that long, as he was already doing me a big favor. I clambered onto the back of the truck. I could see my mother still running toward me in the distance, but she no longer seemed to be carrying the bowl. Years later, she told me the bowl had fallen from her hand when she saw me climbing onto the truck. But she still ran to the spot where we had been sitting, just to make sure I had really gone, although it could not have been anyone else getting onto the truck. There was not a single person around in that vast yellowness.
Thank you. That's such a moving sort of vignette of the agonies that your family has been through, and
Yes.
the separation, the imprisonment. And in this book you tell a huge sweep of Chinese history from the point of view of your grandmother, your mother and yourself, 3 generations. And I'm glad you started by reading about your mother, because am I right in thinking that you felt able to start writing Wild Swans after your mother came to visit you in England and started to talk about the past?
Yes, you're absolutely right. 'Cause I came to Britain in 1978 after the Cultural Revolution ended and Mao died. But for 10 years when I was in Britain, I didn't want to think about China. I didn't want to think about my past, and it was just too painful. I certainly didn't want to write any book. And then in 1988, my mother came to stay with me. This was her first trip abroad, and for the first time she told me the stories of her life and stories of my grandmother and her relationship with my father. And when she started, she couldn't stop. She stayed with me for 6 months, and she talked every day. So by the time she left London, she had left me 60 hours of tape recordings. And when I was listening to my mother, I kept saying to myself, I've got to write all this down. And then I realized how much I loved writing and how much I had always wanted to be a writer. So after my mother left, I sat down, I transcribed her tapes, and I started writing Wild Swans.
And while you were growing up in China, it wouldn't have been possible to be a writer. It would have been far too dangerous.
To be a writer was to enter the most dangerous profession, because under Mao, when I grew up, nearly all writers were condemned in one way or another, sent to the gulag, driven to suicide, some were executed. And even writing for oneself was dangerous. I remember I wrote my first poem on my 16th birthday in 1968. And I was lying in bed polishing my poem when I heard the door banging. The Red Guards had come to raid our flat. And if they got hold of my poem, I would get into trouble and my whole family would get into trouble. So I had to quickly rush to the bathroom. I tore up my poem and flushed it down the toilet. And so that ended my kind of first literary venture. But you see, the desire to write never left me. And in the following years, I was exiled to the edge of the Himalayas. I worked as a peasant, as a barefoot doctor, as a steel worker and an electrician. And when I was spreading manure in the paddy fields, and when I was checking electricity supplies on top of the electricity poles, and I was always writing in my head, but I just couldn't put pen to paper.
And what an extraordinary life you've had, going from that situation of being in exile, working as a peasant on the land, and to where you are now. But of course, that subject matter of your life is actually multiplied by 3, because you tell the story of your grandmother, who began as, her feet were bound. She was given as a concubine to a warlord when she was still in her teens, was living a life which probably seems as strange to most of your Western readers as perhaps, life at the court of King Arthur. And yet, then, in the course of this extraordinary story you have to tell, China and your family moved from that very distant, remote-seeming, sort of pre-modern situation through the great upheavals of the 20th century, so that your history in China seems to have been telescoped. Things have happened so fast in your lifetime and your mother's lifetime, haven't they?
Yes, yes, indeed. My grandmother was the concubine of a warlord general when she was 15. She was born in 1909 in Manchuria in northeast China. Her feet, as you say, were crushed and bound. Her feet were, I didn't bring her shoe. I mean, her feet were like this when she was my size. And basically, only the big toe was allowed to grow, and the other 4 toes were crushed under a big stone. And the binding was there to stop the broken bones from recovering. So from the age of 2, my grandmother lived in excruciating pain. Then at the same age of 15, my mother joined the communist underground because she believed in the communist promises to change all that. And she became a student leader. She did all sorts of things for the communists, including smuggling military information out of her city for the communist forces that were besieging her city in 1948. My mother was arrested, put up against the wall, and the man next to her was shot dead. Wild Swans is the story of the 3 women, and of course a large part is also about my father, because my mother really started telling me the story started with complaining about my father, because when I was in China in the Cultural Revolution, all I saw was how my father got into trouble, my mother stood by him, and so I thought my parents were blissfully, happily married. And one day I was very surprised to hear my mother complain rather bitterly about my father. She married my father when she was 18, and my father was a communist officer with the army besieging her city. And after the communists took her city, they met and fell in love and got married. And soon they had to go from Manchuria in northeast China to Sichuan, which was my father's birthplace. And the journey was 1,000 miles long. And my father was an officer, so he was entitled to a jeep or a horse, whichever was available. And my mother was new to the revolution, so she had to walk. And my father wouldn't give her a lift or wouldn't help her carry, her heavy bedroll and other things, because the communists regarded all this as a form of nepotism, and they had vowed to get rid of nepotism. As a result, my mother suffered a miscarriage on the way. And so there was a lot of that. And then I was born in China in 1952, and because my parents were communist officials, so I grew up in this very privileged environment of the communist elite. We lived in this armed compound with chauffeurs and the cooks and the gardeners. And I grew up so much taking hierarchy and the privilege for granted. And when I first came to Britain, and I thought Britain was wonderfully classless. My views have been modified over the years, of course. And then when I was 14, the violent Cultural Revolution started, and there were atrocities all around me. And they just went against my nature. And so Wild Swans is also about me growing up in this very brainwashed situation when Mao was regarded as our god. When we were children, if we wanted to say, I swear this is true, we would say, I swear to Chairman Mao. But over the years, how I realized that it was Mao had criminally misruled the population and how he was responsible for the famine, the Great Famine between 1958 and 1961. Tens of millions of people died of starvation, and how Mao was also responsible for the Cultural Revolution and all these miseries and the suffering and torment. And it ended with me leaving China after Mao's death. And the thing is, under Mao, there was no proper education for 10 years, and there were no books were burned, no cinemas and theaters and museums, and China became a cultural desert for 10 years. And but I managed to learn a little English because I belong to this very privileged small group of people who had some education. And I went to Sichuan. It's a long story, but I was able to learn English at Sichuan University. But because China was completely isolated from the outside world, even our teachers had never met a foreigner before. So our textbooks were direct translations of Chinese texts. I remember the lesson greetings, because in those days in China, if we bumped into each other, we said, 吃饭了吗？上哪去? Which means, where are you going? Have you eaten? So those were the English greetings I learned. So when I first arrived in London, I used to go around and ask people where they were going and whether they had eaten. I never met a foreigner until I was 23, when as English language students, we were sent to this port in South China to practice our English with the foreign sailors. And we would be sitting in the only restaurant for them, and we would be eagerly awaiting our sailors, and we would grab them as soon as they came on shore. And of course, we had no idea what must be on their minds.
Imagine, yes.
And it was sort of the most bizarre bizarre thing.
Fantastic. And I was very struck, I was just reading Wild Swans again this week, that at one point your mother turns down a boyfriend because he gets mixed up between Flaubert and de Maupassant.
Yes.
And I thought, so young Chinese people were reading Western literature, but there are very few people in this country who knew anything about Chinese culture. And that must have been strange for you to, I imagine that you would have encountered so much ignorance in the people you met here initially about the place you'd come from.
Yes, but that Westerners don't know or didn't know in those days about Chinese literature was not something that upset me. And I think the Chinese did know much more about the West, because modernization, which had started in late 19th century, was in many ways a process of westernization. So China imported all sorts of things, including the whole educational system. I wrote a biography of the Empress Dowager, who started the whole process. So I took for granted that we all read Western literature, but of course not in the Cultural Revolution, which is a different story, when Western books, along with Chinese classics, were also banned. Sorry, just to deviate slightly, but I was able to read, during the Cultural Revolution, to read over 1,000 foreign and Chinese classics. And this was because I had a very entrepreneurial 13-year-old brother who discovered a black market selling books, the books that had escaped the bonfires of the Red Guards. And so my brother bought a lot of books, a huge collection of over 1,000 books. And he made his money dealing in the Mao badge. I don't know whether you know, in those days, we all had to wear these badges of Mao. And there were great varieties of them made of different materials, different sizes, and so on. And my brother became a connoisseur in the Mao badge, and so he made some money on the black market dealing in the Mao badges, because all other collections were banned, and so people's instinct in collecting turned to this sanctioned item. So my brother made his money and bought these books, and I was able to read, you know, from Shakespeare to George Bernard Shaw to, you know, the Maupassant, Flaubert, or in Chinese translation.
And one of the themes of Wild Swans does seem to be the extraordinary sort of ingenuity and just powers of endurance required to get through the terrible upheavals in China during the sort of mid-20th century. And that's an interesting example of it. But as you say, your parents were at one point very privileged high-ups in the Communist Party, and then they fell from favour and became victims of the Communist Party, didn't they? And that must have left the entire family feeling so insecure, so uncertain of how to negotiate this very difficult sort of political kind of minefield you were passing through.
Yes. Although, I mean, we grew up, me and my siblings grew up in this privileged environment. But my father was somebody who was, you know, you might call a true believer or something. You know, he believed in this sort of what was meant to be propaganda, equality, and so on. He was struggling to square that with his privilege as well. So we were never allowed to forget that we were living in privilege, and people were having much harder life all around us. And for example, during the famine, I was walking in the streets munching a steamed bun, and when a boy raced over and snatched it from my hand and rushed away, swallowing the food. And when I told my father, and he said, "You are very lucky because other people were starving." So to lose this sort of a privilege was the least problem I psychologically had to deal with. I think what the Cultural Revolution left in my family was that we grew much closer to each other. And I developed a kind of love for my parents, which would not have existed under normal circumstances. I mean, I wanted to die for my parents, you know, to live through everything with them. And my mother was suffering from hemorrhage in those days. And when she was taken to these denunciation meetings, you know, the victims were stood on the stage and their arms were ferociously twisted to the back and their heads were pushed down and they were kicked and beaten, and my mother was made to kneel on broken glass, you know, facing hysterical crowds of tens of thousands, you know, yelling slogans. And I would go with my mother and sit in a place where she could see me. I thought she could see me. So she knew that, you know, there was somebody who loved her and who was standing by her. And afterwards, I would help my mother go home. So my family became very close when, at the same time, the Cultural Revolution had wrecked tens of millions of families, when children were encouraged to denounce their parents, even to beat them up, you know, horrible, most horrible things, and people were alienated. So I would say, you know, that catastrophe brought out the best in people as well as the worst.
And when you arrived in London, or in this country. You didn't want to write, you said. And so for those 10 years before you started writing Wild Swans, how did you see your life shaping up? Were you expecting to go back to China?
You know, when I first came, the first year, I was on the Chinese government scholarship, and I thought I was going to go back. But I mean, other people, but we all had to say that, because in those days, not to go back meant defection. I mean, you know, we heard these horrible horror stories that, you know, people would be drugged and put in a jute sack and sent back to China. So I, like my fellow students, thought we were going to go back. But when I did go back many years later, and I saw my English language professor, and he said, when I said goodbye to him in 1978, when I was leaving China, and he said to himself he wanted to live to the day when he saw me coming back. So he somehow knew that I couldn't stand the place, and you know, I was dying to get out, I guess because I just felt unhappy all the time. I looked at the pictures of myself in the period. I was never smiling. I mean, I was very intensely unhappy. I think other people could see it, you know, even if I didn't say it to myself. Because growing up under Mao, I think the biggest thing I realized was fear. We lived in this constant fear, and I didn't spell many things out to myself, but suppress those. I mean, that was like writing. And I didn't even dream of being a writer, because I knew how dangerous and impossible that was. So in those 10 years before I became a writer, I had a riveting time. And the thing is, when we first arrived in London, and meaning me and the other people in the group, we were not allowed to go out on our own. We were told not to do this and that and the other. And one thing we were told not to do was to visit an English pub, because the Chinese translation for pub was 酒吧, which suggested somewhere indecent with nude women gyrating. And of course, I was torn with curiosity. I knew there was a pub across the road from the college. And one day I sneaked out of the college, I darted across the road, I pushed the door of the pub open, and of course I saw nothing of the kind, only some men sitting there drinking beer, and I was rather disappointed. You know, the first few years living in Britain, I had the most riveting time. You know, it was like landing on Mars, or Martian landing on Earth. I mean, everything was new. You know, the parks were full of grass. When the China I came from, when I was a child, we had to go out and remove grass from the school lawn, because Mao had even turned against the horticulture and said it was a bourgeois habit. So parks were desert of wasteland. You know, everything, the cinemas, the theaters. I had a student pass. I saw every play very cheaply. And what other, you know, everything, jazz. I heard jazz for the first time. I was riveted. You know, there were so many new things for me to discover. So these years just went by very fast. And you see, the writing would mean for me to look inward and backward to a past that I wanted to forget about.
Yes.
So that's another reason.
But then finally you did write Wild Swans, and it was an immense success very quickly, I think, wasn't it?
Yes.
So you became not just a writer, but a very celebrated writer internationally.
I was very lucky. Yes.
Which makes a sort of a fantastic sequel to the extraordinary story that you tell in the book. But the next episode, the episode of your tremendous success, is another rather astonishing kind of next chapter. And so you went on, in Wild Swans, you'd written about 20th century Chinese history from the point of view of a family, of particularly, your mother, grandmother, and yourself. And then you wrote a big biography of Mao with your husband, John Halliday. So in a way, you were then going over the same ground, but from a very different perspective, weren't you? From the point of, from sort of top down rather than bottom up.
Yes, I mean, I wrote Mao, the biography of Mao, partly because I really wanted to understand him. I mean, when I was writing Wild Swans, there were so many unanswered questions. It wasn't, the biography of Mao was not supposed to be a book documenting his crimes, but a process of understanding him, how he got from a peasant lad to this tyrant and to power, to the tyrant, how did he exercise his power, what made him tick, and what was driving him, and all that, what were his methods, all those things I wanted to understand. And because Wild Swans had made it possible for me to become a writer, so Mao became the obvious next subject. John, my husband, who is the co-author of the biography, was also interested in Mao. So we actually embarked on this project together. We divided our research by language. Because I'm Chinese, so I dealt with all the Chinese language sources. And John, unfortunately, speaks many languages, so he was landed with the rest of the world. And we had the most wonderful 12 years writing the biography of Mao. Well, that's another story now. But we had, so I, in a way, in general, I think life has treated me very well, because I am doing what I wanted to do, to write, and I'm writing the kind of books I wanted to write.
And I think, am I right that Wild Swans is still banned in China?
Yes, indeed.
But you're allowed to travel there?
Well, not so simple. Wild Swans was banned, but after its publication in the early 1990s, I was allowed to go in and travel. And that's how I was able to interview the people around Mao, staff, colleagues, family, etc., to write the biography of Mao. But after the biography of Mao was published in 2005, I became quite sort of dangerous, and there was an attempt to ban me from entering the country. But the British Foreign Office helped me, because my mother is still living there. She's in her 80s, she's frail, she can't travel. She depends on her children, on me going back to see her. And I think the kind of fame of Wild Swans helped. And so I'm allowed to go and visit my mother once a year. Although my books, Wild Swans, the biography of Mao, the biography of Empress Dowager Cixi, are all banned. And my name is banned from Chinese internet. So
you're still seen as a dangerous person?
Yes, I'm. And if anything is written about me, it's instantly deleted.
We started with your reading a passage about your mother. Is your mother very happy that Wild Swans has made her story such a internationally famous story?
My mother is very happy. Yes. I guess because my mother has been through many lives, so she takes things in her stride. She is never sort of overjoyed, just as she has never been kind of crushed by adversity, sudden disasters. But I think she's happy. I mean, I know this because before I finished writing, and just before the book was coming out, I was beginning to worry, you know, whether the book would do well and so on. And my mother wrote to me and she said, the book might not do well and people might not pay attention to it, but you're not to worry. Because, right, she could see that writing the book had brought us closer together. And she said I had made her a happy woman. And so she said that's the most important thing. And so I was, in a way, spared of all the, you know, the agonizing which writers, I think, you know, inevitably do have. And it's just turned out that Wild Swans was a success. So that was quite wonderful. Yes.
Well, thank you very much, Jung Chang. It's been a great privilege to hear you talking about your book, which is now 25 years old, but still being read all over the world. And good luck with the next one.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lucy. Yes.